In the quiet sprawl of Oklahoma City, where residential streets blur into routine and neighbors rarely look twice at one another's doors, a little girl named Locklynn Rose McGuire lived a life that barely had time to begin. Her story did not unfold under bright lights or public scrutiny. It happened behind closed doors, inside a home that, to the outside world, appeared unremarkable. No crime scene tape marked the warning signs in advance. No sirens announced the danger before it arrived. And yet, the events that led to Locklynn's death would later shock investigators, prosecutors, and the public alike, raising haunting questions about responsibility, neglect, and the thin line between accident and crime. Locklynn Rose McGuire was just 2 years old. At that age, life is usually defined by discovery. Words are still forming, trust is instinctive, and danger is something children rely on adults to understand for them. Locklynn depended entirely on the people meant to protect her. Those people were her parents, Darcy Lambert and Jordan McGuire. In the eyes of the law, they were her guardians. In the eyes of the case that would follow, they became its central figures. On the night of November 18, 2025, an emergency call came into authorities in Oklahoma City. The report was brief but alarming. A child was not breathing. First responders arrived at the residence expecting urgency, perhaps a medical crisis, something that could still be reversed. What they encountered instead would mark the beginning of a homicide investigation. Inside the home, Locklynn was found unresponsive. The room where she was discovered was locked. According to official records, the injuries visible on her small body were consistent with an animal attack. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Almost immediately, the case shifted from a medical emergency to something far more serious. As investigators began to process the scene, details emerged that painted a deeply troubling picture. This was not a random incident. This was not an unforeseeable tragedy. According to court documents, the dog involved in Locklynn's death had attacked her once before. That earlier incident occurred roughly 2 weeks prior in early November of the same year. The injuries from that first attack were serious enough to require medical treatment. The warning signs were there. The risk was known. And yet, despite that knowledge, Locklynn was reportedly left alone in a locked room with the same dog. The animal was identified as a pit bull owned by the family. Investigators later noted that multiple animals inside the home appeared malnourished, raising further concerns about neglect and overall conditions within the residence. The pit bull involved was deemed dangerous, but the focus of the investigation did not remain solely on the animal. It shifted squarely onto the adults who made the decisions that placed a vulnerable child in harm's way. Darcy Lambert was in her mid-20s. Jordan McGuire was in his mid-30s. Both were present in Locklynn's life. Both were charged with protecting her. Prosecutors would later argue that this was not a matter of bad luck or poor judgment in a single moment. It was, they claimed, a pattern of reckless disregard. Within days of Locklynn's death, her parents were arrested. Initially, the charges were second-degree murder. As investigators gathered more evidence and reviewed the circumstances surrounding the prior dog attack, those charges were upgraded. Prosecutors announced first-degree murder charges, along with multiple counts related to animal cruelty. The language used in court filings was stark. The state alleged that the parents had knowingly failed to protect their child from a danger they fully understood. Bond was set at approximately $1 million each, reflecting the severity of the allegations. The case drew national attention, not because it involved a stranger or a serial offender, but because it forced the public to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most serious threats to a child come from within their own home. As news of the case spread, reactions poured in. Some viewed it as a tragic accident escalated by grief and shock. Others saw it as a clear case of criminal neglect. Online discussions grew heated, especially around issues of dangerous animals, parental responsibility, and whether the law adequately protects children before tragedy strikes. But beneath the headlines and legal arguments was a quieter reality. A little girl was gone, her life reduced to court documents, evidence photographs, and courtroom arguments. Locklynn Rose McGuire would never grow older than 2. She would never speak for herself. And so, her story would have to be told through the facts left behind. This is a dark psyche case file. If you're finding this investigation compelling, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel and help these stories reach a wider audience. As investigators moved deeper into the case, the focus shifted from the moment of Locklynn Rose McGuire's death to the days and weeks that came before it. In true crime investigations, what happens prior to the fatal event often reveals more than the incident itself. Patterns begin to surface. Decisions are re-examined. Warnings that once seemed minor suddenly take on devastating weight. According to police records and court filings, the dog responsible for Locklynn's death was not unknown to authorities or medical professionals. Roughly 2 weeks before the fatal incident, Locklynn had already been attacked by the same animal. That earlier attack occurred in early November of 2025. The injuries were serious enough that Locklynn required medical attention. This detail would later become central to the prosecution's argument. Medical intervention meant documentation. It meant adults were aware. It meant the danger was no longer hypothetical. In cases involving children, the law draws a clear line between unavoidable tragedy and criminal responsibility. Prosecutors would later argue that once a prior attack had occurred, the responsibility to remove the child from harm became absolute. The risk was no longer hidden. It had already announced itself. Investigators reviewed hospital records, spoke with medical staff, and pieced together what Locklynn's condition had been after that first incident. Though officials did not release every medical detail to the public, the state emphasized one critical point. The injuries were not superficial. This was not a nip or a warning bite. It was an attack significant enough to leave lasting concern. Despite this, Locklynn remained in the same environment. The dog was not removed from the home. No documented steps were taken to ensure the child was kept permanently separated from the animal. What followed was a decision that would later define the entire case. On the night of November 18th, Locklynn was reportedly placed alone in a locked room with the dog. Investigators would later describe this as a deliberate act rather than an accident. Whether the door was locked to keep the child contained, to manage the dog, or for some other reason became a matter of intense scrutiny. What mattered most to prosecutors was the outcome: a defenseless child left alone with an animal already known to be dangerous. Police body camera footage and crime scene photograph showed a home that raised additional concerns. Officers noted that multiple animals inside the residence appeared underfed. Food and water conditions for the dogs were questioned. Animal control officers were called in to assess the situation. The pit bull involved in the fatal attack was ultimately deemed dangerous. But again, the investigation did not stop at the animal. Detectives interviewed Darcy Lambert and Jordan McGuire separately. Their statements, while not fully released to the public, reportedly contained inconsistencies. Investigators looked closely at timelines, at who was responsible for Locklynn at specific moments, and at how much each parent understood about the risk posed by the dog. Prosecutors later described the parents' actions as a malicious failure to protect. That phrase carried weight. In legal terms, it suggested more than negligence. It suggested awareness, followed by inaction. As the case developed, public reaction intensified. Some people struggled to understand how a parent could leave a child alone with an animal that had already caused harm. Others argued that poverty, stress, or lack of education might have played a role. The debate quickly expanded beyond Locklynn herself and into larger conversations about parenting standards, dangerous animals, and systemic failures. Yet the court remained focused on one question: did the parents knowingly place their child in a deadly situation? By the time formal charges were filed, prosecutors felt confident in their answer. The initial second-degree murder charges were upgraded to first-degree murder. Additional charges related to animal cruelty were added, reflecting the conditions found inside the home. Bond was set at roughly $1 million for each parent, effectively ensuring they would remain in custody as the case moved forward. Locklynn's name appeared in headlines across the country. Her photograph circulated online, often paired with commentary that ranged from sorrowful to outraged. But in the courtroom, emotion would not be enough. The case would hinge on evidence, intent, and whether the state could prove that this was not simply a terrible accident but a preventable death. As the legal process began, one reality remained unchanged. Locklynn Rose McGuire could not testify. She could not tell her story. The responsibility to speak for her now rested with investigators, prosecutors, and the facts left behind. This is a dark psyche case file. If you want to continue following this case, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel. As the case against Darcy Lambert and Jordan McGuire moved forward, prosecutors began assembling a narrative meant to show intent through behavior rather than words. In the absence of a confession, the state focused on choices: what the parents knew, what they did, and what they failed to do. Central to the prosecution's case was the concept of foreseeability. In criminal law, especially in cases involving children, the question is not always whether harm was intended, but whether it was reasonably predictable. According to court filings, the fatal outcome was not only predictable, it was avoidable. The earlier dog attack became the cornerstone of this argument. Investigators emphasized that once Locklynn Rose McGuire had already been injured by the same dog, the danger could no longer be dismissed as theoretical. The family had first-hand proof. Medical professionals had been involved. The risk had already crossed the threshold from possibility to reality. Prosecutors argued that instead of responding by removing the dog, rehoming it, or permanently separating it from the child, the parents allowed conditions to remain unchanged. In the eyes of the state, this inaction transformed the home itself into a hazard. During pretrial hearings, the court was presented with evidence showing that the dog involved had ongoing behavioral issues. While not every detail was made public, animal control assessments supported the claim that the animal posed a serious risk. The fact that other dogs in the home appeared malnourished further reinforced the argument that the environment was unsafe, not just for Locklynn, but for all living beings inside the residence. Defense attorneys approached the case from a different angle. They suggested that the parents did not intend harm and that the fatal incident was a tragic convergence of poor decisions rather than a deliberate act. They emphasized grief, shock, and the chaos that can exist in households under stress. In their view, the line between negligence and murder was not as clear as the prosecution claimed. But prosecutors countered this by returning to one haunting detail: the locked room. According to investigative reports, Locklynn was not merely in the same space as the dog. She was alone with it, behind a closed and locked door. This fact raised questions that went beyond momentary lapse. Why was the door locked? Who locked it? And why was a child placed in confinement with an animal already known to be dangerous? The state argued that this decision demonstrated conscious disregard. Locking the door removed any possibility of intervention. It eliminated supervision. It ensured that if something went wrong, no adult would be present to stop it. As the legal battle unfolded, public interest in the case continued to grow. Courtrooms filled. Online discussions intensified. Some viewers saw the parents as villains. Others saw them as deeply flawed individuals whose mistakes had irreversible consequences. The case became a mirror, reflecting broader fears about child safety and accountability. Meanwhile, Locklynn's life was increasingly defined by paperwork, evidence logs, medical records, police reports. In death, she became a subject of legal analysis rather than a child who once laughed, cried, and depended on others for protection. The judge overseeing the case reminded both sides that emotion, while unavoidable, could not replace proof. The trial would not be about public outrage or sympathy. It would be about whether the state could meet its burden of showing that the parents' actions rose to the level of first-degree murder under Oklahoma law. As pretrial motions continued, one thing was clear. This case was no longer just about a dog attack. It was about responsibility, about whether love without action is enough, and about how the justice system responds when a child dies under circumstances that should never have existed in the first place. This is a dark psyche case file. If you're following along, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel and help keep these investigations visible. By the time the case entered its next phase, the courtroom had become less about shock and more about structure. The initial headlines had already done their work. The public knew a child had died. They knew a dog was involved. They knew the parents were charged with first-degree murder. What remained was the slow, methodical process of determining whether the law could transform moral outrage into legal certainty. Prosecutors began refining their strategy, focusing not on emotion, but on sequence. In criminal trials, especially those involving children, timelines matter. Each decision is placed under a microscope. Each moment is weighed against what a reasonable adult should have done under the same circumstances. The state emphasized that this was not a sudden event without context. Locklynn Rose McGuire's death did not occur in isolation. It came after warnings, after injuries, after documented evidence that the dog posed a real threat. The prosecution argued that the fatal incident was the final link in a chain of preventable failures. Witness lists grew. Medical professionals who treated Locklynn after the first attack were expected to testify about the severity of her injuries. Animal control officers prepared to explain the condition of the dogs found in the home. Law enforcement officers reviewed their body camera footage repeatedly, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized in court. The locked room remained central. Prosecutors described it as a symbol of abandonment, a place where supervision ended and danger was allowed to operate unchecked. The state argued that locking a child alone with a known dangerous animal crossed the boundary from negligence into deliberate indifference. Defense attorneys pushed back against that framing. They maintained that while the outcome was tragic, the intention to kill was absent. Their argument centered on the idea that bad judgment, even catastrophic bad judgment, does not automatically equal first-degree murder. They questioned whether the state could prove beyond reasonable doubt that the parents acted with the level of intent required by law. In Oklahoma, first-degree murder charges require more than carelessness. They require proof that the defendants acted with extreme disregard for human life. The defense argued that the prosecution was attempting to stretch that definition, fueled by public outrage rather than legal precedent. As hearings continued, the judge allowed key pieces of evidence to move forward. The prior attack was deemed admissible. The condition of the animals in the home was allowed into the record. The state was permitted to argue that the parents' knowledge of danger made the final outcome foreseeable. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to ripple through public discourse. Child welfare advocates pointed to the tragedy as evidence that existing systems fail to intervene early enough. Others debated the role of dangerous animals in family homes. Online discussions became polarized, but the court remained insulated from that noise. For Locklynn, none of it mattered anymore. Her presence in the courtroom existed only through photographs, reports, and testimony. She was described not as a living child, but as a victim, a legal term that carries weight but strips away individuality. As jury selection loomed, both sides understood what was at stake. For the prosecution, this case represented accountability. For the defense, It represented the danger of criminalizing tragedy, and for the justice system itself, it was a test of how far responsibility extends when protection fails at the most basic level. As jury selection drew closer, the weight of the case began to settle into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. The shock that had once surrounded Locklynn Rose McGuire's death was gradually replaced by legal language, motions, and procedural steps. This phase of the process is often invisible to the public, but it is where the foundation of a trial is truly built. The prosecution focused on narrowing distractions. They made it clear that this case was not about breed debates, nor was it about generalized animal behavior. It was about knowledge and action. What mattered, they argued, was not what the dog was capable of, but what the parents already knew it had done. In filings submitted to the court, prosecutors emphasized that the earlier attack on Locklynn was not an isolated incident buried in uncertainty. It was recent. It was documented. It was serious. Medical records established a timeline that showed the family had clear warning signs less than 3 weeks before the fatal incident. In the state's view, this short window made the parents' failure to act even more significant. The defense, meanwhile, worked to humanize Darcy Lambert and Jordan McGuire. They portrayed a household overwhelmed by circumstance rather than malice. In their filings and statements, they argued that grief, confusion, and poor decision-making can coexist without crossing into criminal intent. They warned that setting a precedent in this case could open the door to charging parents with murder for a wide range of tragic accidents. Behind the scenes, legal experts debated the case quietly. Some noted that prosecutions of this nature are rare but not unheard of. Others pointed out that the locked room detail placed this case in a different category altogether. That single decision, prosecutors argued, removed plausible deniability. It suggested preparation rather than spontaneity. As evidence lists were finalized, the emotional reality of the case became unavoidable. Prosecutors prepared exhibits that would demonstrate the layout of the home, the condition of the room, and the timeline leading up to the emergency call. Care was taken to ensure the presentation remained respectful and compliant with courtroom standards. The goal was not to shock the jury, but to establish clarity. Animal control officers prepared testimony regarding the condition of the dogs. Malnourishment was not presented as a separate moral failing, but as supporting evidence of neglect. Prosecutors argued that neglect toward animals reflected a broader pattern of irresponsibility within the household. Throughout this process, Locklynn's absence remained the most powerful presence in the room. Every argument, every objection, and every legal maneuver revolved around decisions made on her behalf. She had no agency. She had no voice. And yet her name anchored every filing and every hearing. Public attention, though still present, began to wane slightly as the case settled into legal routine. This is often the phase where true crime stories fade from headlines, even though the consequences are just beginning. Families continue grieving, defendants remain incarcerated, and the justice system moves forward at its own pace. For prosecutors, the challenge remained steep. First-degree murder is one of the most serious charges the state can bring. It requires jurors to believe not only that the parents failed Locklynn, but that they did so with extreme disregard for her life. The defense planned to argue that while mistakes were made, murder was too heavy a label. As the trial date approached, one truth remained uncontested. Locklynn Rose McGuire's death was not inevitable. It was not unforeseeable. Whether the law would define it as criminal would soon be decided, but the loss itself was absolute. This is a dark psyche case file. If you're still following this case and want to see how justice unfolds, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel. As the case entered its final phase, the courtroom atmosphere shifted once again. What had once been defined by investigation and accusation was now shaped by anticipation. The question was no longer what had happened, but how it would be judged. For the prosecution and defense alike, this stage represented the moment where narrative met consequence. By this point, Locklynn Rose McGuire's name had become inseparable from legal terminology. Her identity existed primarily through evidence summaries and witness statements. The simplicity of her life stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the arguments built around her death. She was 2 years old, yet her case demanded adult concepts like intent, foreseeability, and culpability. Prosecutors prepared to bring their argument full circle. Their case rested on a central assertion that Locklynn's death was not the result of a single bad decision, but of repeated choices made in full awareness of danger. They emphasized that protection is not passive. It requires action, especially after harm has already occurred. In closing preparations, the state returned to the timeline. Early November marked the first attack. Medical care followed. Warnings were implicit. From that moment forward, prosecutors argued every decision carried added weight, leaving the dog in the home, allowing continued proximity, and ultimately placing Locklynn alone behind a locked door with an animal that had already proven capable of serious harm. The defense, meanwhile, refined a different message. They focused on intent as defined by law. They acknowledged failure without conceding malice. Their position was that tragedy does not automatically equate to murder, and that the justice system must be careful not to criminalize grief after the fact. They argued that hindsight can distort judgment, that what seems obvious after a death may not have been perceived the same way in real time. They urged the court to consider whether the parents truly understood the severity of the risk, or whether they underestimated it in a moment of flawed reasoning. Observers noted that the locked room detail remained the most difficult element for the defense to overcome. It suggested separation rather than supervision, finality rather than oversight. Prosecutors repeatedly framed it as a decision that removed all safeguards at once. As legal arguments reached their peak, public discourse returned. Media coverage resurfaced. Commentators debated the broader implications of the case. Some asked whether similar situations existed unnoticed in other homes. Others questioned where the line should be drawn between parental autonomy and state intervention. Child welfare advocates pointed to Locklynn's case as a warning. They argued that systems often wait until after tragedy to act, rather than responding decisively when early signs appear. In this sense, Locklynn's death became not only a criminal matter, but a societal mirror. For the court, however, philosophy had limits. The verdict would rest on evidence, not symbolism. Jurors would be tasked with deciding whether Darcy Lambert and Jordan McGuire's actions met the legal threshold for first-degree murder, or whether a lesser charge or acquittal was more appropriate under the law. Throughout it all, Locklynn remained at the center, even in absence. Her story was not told through memories or milestones, but through warnings unheeded. The justice system could not give her life back. It could only determine whether accountability would follow. As the case reached its closing moments, the courtroom became a place of stillness. The arguments had been made. The evidence had been presented. What remained was reflection. In many trials, this is the moment when the weight of what has been lost finally settles, stripped of strategy and legal positioning. The prosecution's closing statements returned once more to responsibility. They reminded the court that childhood is defined by dependence, that a 2-year-old cannot assess danger, cannot advocate for safety, cannot remove themselves from harm. Those duties, they argued, belong entirely to the adults in charge. When those adults are aware of danger and choose inaction, the law must respond. They spoke of Locklynn Rose McGuire not as an abstract victim, but as a child who trusted without question. They emphasized that the justice system exists precisely for those who cannot protect themselves. In their final words, prosecutors framed the case as a line drawn in law, one meant to affirm that preventable loss carries consequences. The defense's final statements were quieter. They focused on humanity rather than accusation. They acknowledged failure and grief, but warned against conflating tragedy with criminal intent. They urged the court to consider the permanence of a first-degree murder conviction and the standard required to justify it. Their argument rested on restraint, on the idea that justice must be measured even in the face of sorrow. When deliberations began, Locklynn's name lingered in the room. Jurors were tasked not only with evaluating facts, but with defining accountability. This is the burden of the legal system in cases involving children. Every verdict sends a message, not just to those involved, but to society as a whole. Regardless of outcome, the facts of the case remain unchanged. A prior attack occurred. A known danger existed. A child was left alone behind a locked door with an animal that had already caused harm. Those truths are permanent. They do not shift with opinion or time. Beyond the courtroom, Locklynn's story continues to resonate. It appears in discussions about child safety, parental responsibility, and the systems meant to intervene before tragedy occurs. Her name now exists in legal archives, in media reports, and in the collective memory of a public forced to confront uncomfortable realities. True crime often focuses on perpetrators, motives, and outcomes, but at its core, it is about loss. Locklynn Rose McGuire's life was brief, but her story carries weight far beyond its length. It challenges assumptions, it demands vigilance, and it reminds us that silence and inaction can be just as consequential as intent. This case does not offer easy answers. It offers responsibility, it offers consequence, and it leaves behind a question that echoes long after the courtroom empties. How many warnings are enough before protection becomes non-negotiable? This has been a Dark Psyche Case File. If you believe stories like this matter, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel and help ensure that voices lost too soon are not forgotten.